All right, I'm going to do it just because they gave me a gavel. So
All right.
let's go ahead and call the April 7th, 2022 Capital Funding Protection Committee meeting to order. And with that, if we could have a roll call, please.
Paul Anderson,
Here?
Elise Bunkowski,
Here.
Charlene Bybee,
Here.
Sophie Cardinal,
Here.
Oscar Delgado, Andrew Diss,
Here.
Jean Herman, Justin Ivory,
Here.
Bob Lucy, Devin Reese,
Here.
and Dave Solaro.
Here. All right. Before we jump into section 2, I'm going to go ahead and recognize Trustee Nicolette and Mayberry. They're here and like to give us, I'm guessing, some words of encouragement. How's that? Oh, well, that's what I'm hoping for. So.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the Capital Funding Protection Committee meeting. Thank you. I'm Adam Mayberry. I'm one of the trustees for the school board, District F, as in fantastic. I think this might be the first time I've ever given public comment, and I've been in the public sector for a long time, so it's a real privilege to be here. We just wanted to, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, thank all of you for your continued service on this important committee. We know it takes a lot of your time and effort for our elected officials to serve, as well as those that are appointed. It's a critical committee for us to keep the promise we made with respect to WC1 a few years ago. So those are our thoughts, and we just want to encourage you to continue to do the great work and appreciate the patience and all of your dedication to what you're doing. So thank you very much. Trustee Nicolette?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to expand upon that a little bit. I've got two sides, but I'm really very quick. Crush your fingers. Again, thank you for all that you do, and we mean that sincerely. You are a group of experts. I will say that the commitment, the expertise, and the integrity, I will speak for myself right now, gives me comfort, and the reliability factor makes my decision-making, I believe, much better because of your work. And now I will say for all of the trustees that we want to thank you for all that you do, because we understand the deep dives that you continually do to ensure the stewardship of the Washoe County School District, and the partnering that you do with our departments is integral to the integrity of our work and our, I guess, ability to make sound decisions. They're not always decisions that everybody likes, but we all understand that that's an impossibility because everybody has their own ideas. But because of your integrity and commitment to doing the work, you bring to us some comfort, and that's really important when we are responsible for millions and millions of dollars and people looking to us to make informed decisions that are best for our students, our employees, and our community. And you are integral to that decision making. I want to say specifically your review of the 5-year capital improvement plan, and you know how we love our acronyms, CIP, is so important that we've got your eyes on those numbers and on those projects and on the future that again contributes to a collective that can make sound decisions. I reached out to Adam and Mark because they're really your side-by-side partners. And I will tell you that some of the things that they shared with me, I want to share with you. That last year's review of the spending and use of WC1 resources verified That was the word that Mark used, verified that WC1 revenues were spent in compliance with statutes and the parameters of how WC1 funds are supposed to be used. You helped inform that, and we want to again thank you. It contributes to that stewardship, and that builds that trust that my colleague was talking about, trust in our work. Finally, this comes from Adam.
This ad.
Oh, yes, thank you. That Adam, Adam Searcy. We want to extend an invitation to the J. Wood Raw Elementary School groundbreaking, which is Friday, April 15th at 11 o'clock. And the address, I didn't know the address until Adam told me, so here's the address. Now you have the address. Is 10600 Green Pasture Drive, Reno. It's off of Rio Wrangler and just a little west of Damani Ranch High School. So please join us Friday, April 15th at 11 o'clock for the groundbreaking. You probably get to wear one of those cool hats and vests, and that's always a nice picture op. And just in closing, thank you so much for what you do. We're friends and we're partners. We may not always agree and we ask tough questions of each other, but that's what makes the work of such high integrity. And you are appreciated. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to item 2.01, approval of the minutes for February 3rd, 2022. I have a motion by Reese, second by Dis. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, passes unanimously. 2.02, information and discussion on the anticipated cadence and workload for future meetings of the Capital Funding Protection Committee. Mr. Searcy.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Searcy, for the record, Chief of Facilities for the school district. This is our standing item, really kind of helps keep us all on the same pace and kick off our meetings. We're skipping over the agenda, looking ahead on this one to June, our next regularly scheduled meeting, where we anticipate our annual programs coming to the committee for approval. So as we did last year, we'll present them separately. Our IT device refresh program for FY23 and our capital renewal program will be presented in detail and be recommended for approval at that time. You're going to see this next one reoccurring as we go out through the look ahead here, but that's more of a placeholder should specific projects need budget allocation from the committee. Moving into August, we'll put a big fat if necessary there and see what comes of it. Of course, our terms, our appointed members are on fiscal year terms, so we may or may not have some new members or some new officers. But more importantly, I also want you to pencil in the dates, at least, of the ribbon cutting ceremonies. Those are as official as they need to be said in a public meeting at this point at O'Brien Middle School on August 1st and the new Hug High School on August 2nd look to be really, really positive and exciting community celebrations, and I just as soon celebrate with you guys there than in one of these meetings. So we'll see. That's our regularly scheduled August meeting. Moving into our regularly scheduled, what technically would be October, but we'll look to move that likely 1 week earlier to avoid the school district's fall break. That would then fall on September 29th. If we skip August, we might still have some cleanup to do, but we'll talk quite a bit tonight about what we've referred to as a facilities master plan or a comprehensive modernization study that we're proposing to embark on, and hope that by September, but certainly as we move forward into December and February meetings, we'll have significant updates from our vendor and perhaps community members and staff on our progress, as well as engaging with the committee on feedback at that time. Item 3 here, again, you see showing up the project-specific allocations stemming from the 5-year CIP. We'll see as things develop if there is a specific project allocation that warrants action. But at this time, this is what September is shaping up to look like. Moving into December, we'll have, we're going to talk about this evening as well. External review of agreed upon procedures, this external audit item that we've talked about. We're shooting for a final report out before the end of the calendar year to kind of coincide with our annual accountability report, as we have in the past on that calendar year-end review type of reporting in our December meeting, as well as an update on that comprehensive modernization study. And then to round out this look ahead into February 2023 is where at this time we're targeting a final approval, hopefully, for that comprehensive modernization study. And by the time we get there, you'll know a lot about that. It looks to be pretty significant and pretty exciting, but we want to be set ourselves up with this pace to gain the input and approval of this committee and ultimately the Board of Trustees as well. And that kind of rounds out our look ahead. So any questions or discussion on that? Again, this is really just to kind of keep us in sync, as we only meet every other month at most. Thank you.
Any questions? Go ahead.
Justin Ivory for the record. On the IT device refresh, I know last year when we approved that, there was discussion about perhaps just taking a look at how that's working. Will you have somebody here to give us kind of rundown on the use and how well it's working for that?
Absolutely. Last year, as you recall, or the year that we're in, was the first time we've done something like this. So I definitely anticipate a little bit more robust presentation on how it's gone and what we've learned and how that informs our proposed FY23 plan. So there'll be several of us presenting in quite a bit of detail all that information.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Let's go ahead and move on to item 2.03 is presentation and discussion on the plan scope, timing, and proposed procedures related to an audit of the professional services of the capital improvement program. So I'm guessing, Mr. Searcy, you'll take this one, start us out, and then roll in your committee members as necessary.
Absolutely. Again, for the record, Adam Searcy, our school district chief internal auditor, Kirk Starkey is here as well. I'll give the overview in your packet, or in the attached with the public agenda are a variety of attachments. I'll start there. I'll start with the history of this topic. As you may recall, in August of 2021, we presented an update as to the incorporation of the recommendations stemming from the 2020 audit of external review of agreed upon procedures. That led to some discussion about some scope, particularly around vendor engagements, that was intentionally not included in the 2020 audit. Since then, we've had discussion items at our October and our December 2021 Capital Funding Protection Committee meetings, as well as calls with vendors, internal staff, and member Ivory and Cardinal of the Capital Funding Protection Committee to better understand what the most appropriate next steps might be towards a continued external review of the WC1 expenditures by the school district. So that's kind of how we got here this afternoon. Again, the attachments tonight, I felt it was valuable to put as a part of the record past audits, which have been completed in 2013 and 2014 by our internal audit department. Those long since passed, but I thought valuable information for the record. A lot of our current internal practices, policies, and procedures are actually informed and stemmed out of those reviews. As everyone certainly recalls, 2016 was an audit of sorts, a public referendum on the school district capital projects department, which in the form of WC1 led to the creation of the Capital Funding Protection Committee. Tremendous work ensued 2017, 2018, wherein the conversations began about what became the 2020 external audit, bringing us back to where we were a moment ago, August, October, December. So that kind of brings us again to where we are here today. We've compiled the draft scope of services that we've attached here. This essentially is intended to review the compliance of the school district's work with applicable state statutes, NRS, and school district policies and procedures with respect to vendor services. So this, again, was something that was intentionally not included in the 2020 audit, and this scope looks to include that, or really almost close that entire review process, specifically the selection, the actual agreements or the contract language with these vendors, the monitoring and tracking, the actual administration of these vendor contracts, and then any recourse or remediation clauses or best practices that the school district employs. It's a lengthy scope, or it's a draft scope, but it's one that we feel will not only address some of the concerns that have been voiced by the committee, but provide the community with that external review of these significant expenditures that the school district's engaged in towards these projects. A little bit about the schedule. Should this go forward today, we're anticipating engaging with a vendor after school begins. So late summer, early fall, due in large part to our current summer workload in the 3 major schools that we're shooting to open in August. But again, with that target completion of December for reporting back to the committee, that's really not arbitrarily identified, but intended only to coincide with our annual year-end reporting. So if that slid into February for whatever reasons, we'd give you that update. But that's our proposal. Later in this evening's agenda, as we always do, we have an item here really to discuss the proposal, but then in, I believe, item 2.06, we're proposing a budget to afford these external review services. And that budget authorization, as we always clarify, is expected not to be exceeded. We are proposing a budget authorization from this committee of $100,000 for this audit engagement. We authorized the same budget 2 years ago for the previous services. We came in well below that number and absolutely expect to come in below that number again with this engagement. And the last thing I'll add is that, while we agree this is very important, this has been a bit of a, protracted discussion on the scope and schedule. I think everybody seems to agree that an external review is very healthy and warranted, and that we have had some great feedback and some great input on how we might look following this engagement, how we might look going forward to establishing a more standardized scope and frequency of these types of external reviews, so that it doesn't burden this committee with discussion of exactly what we should do, that rather we have a more standardized sampling or scope that we can competitively solicit and just plan for both staff, the committee, and the public to kind of rely on. This was the first of its kind, so I appreciate that there's been a little bit of extra discussion warranted, but I think for everyone's benefit, assuming this goes well and we're ready to move forward with a routine program, that's something that has been voiced and I wanted to reiterate on the record. So I'll leave it at that. This is the proposed scope of services as I just described. Later, we're offering a proposed budgetary allocation. And I would like to recognize Member Ivory and Member Cardinal for their particular engagement on this and their time outside of these meetings informing and guiding, as well, of course, staff, CFO Mark Mathers, and our audit chief, Kirk Starkey. That's all from me. Thank you.
Any questions, comments, anything else from members of the committee?
I'll go. Sophie Cardinal for the record. So thank you for that great overview of what we've been doing with this item over the past several months. So I think you already know this. I wanted to jump into the routine audit engagement rather than go back and focus on the professional services part. So I just wanted to put that out there, that this scope of work really is to capture what was missed in the original, well, what some members feel was missed in the original audit from 2020. That's correct, right? Okay. So this is just going to cover professional services. So I just want to make sure everyone understands that. I am okay with this because I feel like we've had lots of discussion about it and it's something that the committee feels like it's needed. But I do want to put on the record that going forward, I would really vote for and support a more standardized scope and frequency, like you've mentioned. So I'm not going to hold it up today, but I do want to put that out there, that I really feel like there's a lot of benefit, cost-wise too, to getting onto a standard routine schedule for some sort of audit or agreed upon procedure. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is the $100,000. That seems really steep to me still. I'm looking at the budget assumption and it says that they're only going to look at 3 to 4 vendors. So I'm assuming that's 3 to 4 professional services contracts. That doesn't seem like a lot to me for $100,000. I mean, I know there's a lot in there, but I just wanted to put that out there. That seems high. So that's all I have.
Member Ivory, for the record. A couple things. One, I would absolutely agree. After we get through this, I know it's been kind of cumbersome because we didn't exactly know what we wanted either. But once we get through this, absolutely, let's get into something that's pretty routine so that, you know, so that there's just a good quality checks and balance system, I think is what everybody is wanting to see. I don't disagree. I don't know how much auditing costs, so you know, that's where I'd fall on you guys. It's, you know, it's going to be what's going to be. Obviously, it sounds like it's going to be kind of almost like a T&M not to exceed type of. It could very easily come in under the 100,000. So hopefully that's what we'll see.
So just for the record, procedurally, should this budget be authorized at any level, we'll solicit proposals from vendors and we'll negotiate with them for scope and fee, and then ultimately take that contract to our board for appropriate execution. It wouldn't necessarily come back to this committee except for the updates or the report when it's finalized.
Okay, Sophie Cardinal for the record. So you don't already have someone in mind for this engagement then? I thought you were planning to use what was it?
Yeah, we've
Protivity?
spoken with Protivity, is the firm's name, who performed the services for us last time, and we're likely going to request a proposal from them first, due in large part to their familiarity with the district's processes and these particular projects, if for no other reason than cost effectiveness as well. And because of the semi-custom nature of this particular scope, but we don't have any commitment to them contractually at this time.
Well, that actually makes me feel a lot better to know that you have this scope that you can take out and solicit from other vendors. So I like that, and I think it's a great idea to make sure that we're not overpaying for these services. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments related to this item? No? All right. Then let's go ahead and move on to item 2.04, which is a presentation, discussion, and possible action to recommend approval of the fiscal year 2023-2027 5-year capital improvement plan. Mr. Searcy and Mr. Mathers.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we've got a significant presentation, and in your packets, you should also have a significant attachment with a detailed breakdown of the actual CIP. This is for action. This one is for action, and the action is to recommend approval to the Board of Trustees that they adopt this 5-year CIP. So diving into the presentation, we've got a little bit of a definition about what this really is. This is a plan that is required by state law to be included in the school district's budget. It does not it is rather inclusive of all of the capital funding revenue sources. So you'll see items in the CIP that don't always necessarily come before this committee, but we do that intentionally to be as inclusive and transparent as possible, really. Again, what it is a plan, a 5-year plan, which provides not only the needs and the projects as we foresee them, but also the financing and available resources to deliver on those projects. That's why it coincides with the budget. But it is not a specific authorization by this committee or the school board for any of these projects. Almost each and every one of them will have to come back for individual budget allocation and various approvals. Sure, most of you see these from your public works department and budget directors, so very similar. But when we are going through this, you're going to hear this repeatedly this afternoon through the development process, looking first at our growth and capacity from almost a prioritization standpoint, then looking at our existing facilities, our assets associated with those existing facilities, like we talk about with our annual capital renewal program, our roofs, our pavement, our flooring, and then looking at our existing facilities. And we're going to hear a lot more about that tonight, but looking at those 3 major components of our CIP, coming up with a draft program of needs or projects, and then working with our business and finance team to model our forecasted revenues and resources to right size our program to the available resources. So Mr. Mathers is going to go through this a bit with you, and then I'll dive into more detail on the projects themselves.
Great, thanks, Adam. Mark Mathers, Chief Financial Officer. So obviously for any budget or capital improvement program, there's a constraint, and that constraint is revenues. We can't overspend what we project and forecast to be our sources. When we look at this district's capital improvement program, really there's 2 major sources of revenues, which we've gone over before. The first that's existed for a long time is property taxes. That growth has been very strong over the last several years, over 7%. And in the future, we at least immediately project a continued strong growth based on development in the region and the higher property tax caps we have. So certainly over 6% a year growth. And then the second, obviously newer revenue source, thanks to voters in 2016, is the WC1 sales tax. And that has shown incredibly strong growth over the last 2 fiscal years, up more than 15% in both fiscal years. So we're fortunate in that we have seen those revenues track or exceed inflation. So that has really helped out. And then there's one fairly minor revenue source, our government services tax, which all of us entities, all cities and counties receive a portion of, and the school district does as well for capital projects. So those are the revenues we really focus on when developing the CIP. And as Adam said, it's a iterative back and forth, depending on the phasing of projects and the size of those projects. We may need to move projects back and forth based on those revenue constraints. So there's a lot of iterative modeling that goes on, but this lays out, again, the 5 years of projected sources. And so that includes, in the case of sales tax, both ongoing sources that are available for both supporting our debt and on a pay-as-you-go basis for capital projects. And then property taxes are actually received in a debt service fund and are transferred in to the capital improvement program when appropriate, but more so to pay debt service on the rollover bonds we issue that pledge those property tax revenues. So I won't go through every line of this, thankfully for you. I will say for sales tax, again, those have been strong, more than 15%. But as we look forward, a lot of that growth was, as we look in the rearview mirror, a lot of that growth really was based on stimulus. And so there were, as we'll go later into this, there were a couple months during COVID when we saw drops in revenue, and then it just took off as federal stimulus dollars were received by households and people were stuck at home and buying stuff on the internet and so forth. Going forward, at least for next year, we are concerned about a possible retracement in spending as that stimulus funding has ceased. There's the possibility of a recession that most of you read about. Gas prices have reduced people's discretionary income. And so to be very conservative, we have projected 0% growth in fiscal year 23 for sales tax revenues. And if we see higher revenues that actually come in 23, we can always augment the budget. But for now, we wanted to be very careful in what we forecasted in 23. And thereafter, we assume kind of a more standard 5% growth rate. As noted, we have a mixture of debt financing and pay-as-you-go that we're using. Hopefully you have this in front of you as we're kind of through to some technical issues. But you'll see we do plan on a number of rollover bond issuances, $103 million in fiscal year 23 and just under $200 million in fiscal year 24. Again, when we model this, we look at projected revenues, we look at our debt profile. We're fortunate in that we have a significant amount of rollover bonds rolling off, no pun intended, maturing after fiscal year 27, and that gives us a lot of capacity to issue new debt. So these are bonds issued 20 years ago that are finally coming due, and so they will drop off and we won't need to pay debt service on those older bonds, thereby freeing up resources for new bonds. And then in terms of WC1 sales tax, which we'll talk about more, again, we do modeling. We internally like to have a coverage factor of at least 25%. So 25% buffer of sales tax over our debt service because we know sales taxes are volatile. We saw that in the Great Recession. We're well above that currently, but that's kind of our own internal constraint. We don't want to, issue debt to use up every last cent of projected sales tax revenues because we know unexpected things can happen. So that's a summary of our sources. As you can see, they are significant, and we will have slides going forward that speak to that.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we move on to the next page, Charlene Bybee for the record. Could you clarify on your beginning fund balances? Because they really are fluctuating pretty dramatically from 21 million our first year to 93 to 136. I know that probably when it's beginning fund, it depends on how much we're projecting to spend in upcoming years. I'm guessing that's where it comes from, but there's such a discrepancy. Could you kind of clarify that for me, who's not an accountant?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is a little choppy looking, isn't it? We had a much significantly higher fund balance, but with moving up W. Smith CTE bids and so forth, we've kind of accounted for the use of those monies when we start with a $21 million fund balance. In terms of our actual cash, so this is based kind of on encumbrance budgeting. In terms of our actual cash, we probably will be closer to $70 million. So it's not quite from 20 to 90 like you see here. But we have to account for the fact that those funds are encumbered and we've got to pay for them. So from a budgeting standpoint, we allocate all those monies as if they're going to be spent when the contract is led. So again, this is based somewhat on project costs being a little bit lumpish, which you don't see yet. That's in a couple pages. Certainly we can choose, and this is one of the kind of decision points we make in the finance office, to issue less bonds than you see there. So what we don't want to do is overissue and have a ton of cash that's earning less than 1% currently. So we could choose to downsize ultimately in year 2 from 196 million that we issued to something less than that based on actual needs. But in this case, again, we want to make sure we have the funding locked in before we go bid a project. And, at some point, we stopped modeling this because we know years 2 through 5, as Adam said, is just a plan. And so we will see how revenues actually come in and the actual projects that are ready to be bid.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I have a question on that too.
Yeah.
Sophie Cardinal for the record. So I think maybe how I'm interpreting this is this 204 million in year 1, that's the total money coming in. And then it's not on this page, but I'm assuming then we expect to spend the difference that would then, because I see the jump in beginning fund balance is about 70 million from year 1 to year 2. So you're saying at the end of year 1, what we would have left over from total money coming in versus money coming out is about 70 million.
An increase of 70 million, yes.
So I think that's really the answer to your question too, is that we're going to have an extra 70 million left, and that's what increases the 21 million to the 93. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. So on the next slide, slide 7, we just summarize again our revenue sources, and really it's almost half and half between rollover bonds and WC1 resources, whether that comes in as revenues that we use for pay-as-you-go projects, or whether those are new bonds issued that pledge those WC1 revenues. So it's again about half and half, and as you can see on the you can't see on the preceding page, as you'll see later in the presentation, WC1 sales taxes are nearly caught up to our property tax revenues. WC1 sales taxes are around 60 million and property tax revenues around 70 million. So it does split out roughly half and half. So that is a very high level summary of our revenues. It's something we pay close attention to, and we'll have more slides to talk about it in more detail later in the presentation.
All right, so I'm going to forge ahead and try to multitask here a little bit. I've never wanted my computer to restart quite so swiftly as I am right now. But on slide 8, we try to summarize this entire CIP into 3 major categories. Major projects, capital renewal that I kind of previously just described, and then what's described here as core school investments, or major projects within our existing schools. And that sort of theme or that summary is going to be repeated throughout this afternoon. On slide 9, I'm getting close here, you guys. Keep your fingers crossed. All right, on slide 9 is the corresponding proposed project expenditures, mirroring or informing the year-over-year balance updates on the financial ledger. So this one I'll spend a little bit more time just sort of summarizing these projects, and we'll talk in detail as the presentation goes forward. Yeah, I'm not feeling it here. Boy. Can't quite multitask this, so we're gonna go with pen and paper.
Old school.
Yeah. All right. Everybody's got a copy in front of them. I think we're on 10. Slide 9. Right. We've got all the major projects listed by name, and we're not gonna spend much time. Look at that. See, it's user error. Come on, man.
Seconds. Just
John, you're the man, John. All right, don't touch anything. Slide 9. Got my baby blanket back here. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the line items referring to Debbie Smith CTA and what's now known as the J. Wood Raw Elementary School there. Those are really trailing costs that are associated with previously approved budgets, largely FF&E expenditures. What we want to focus our time on here this afternoon are going forward expenditures. I'll talk a little bit now about the transportation expansion, as it's titled. It's been previously titled expansion. I want to take the opportunity to kind of clarify that as we continue to struggle with transportation services and demand even across the district. This is going to be a facility upgrade. So our existing transportation yard have, unpaved lots and antiquated facilities, both for mechanical repair, office staff, and even underground fuel storage tanks, things of that nature that desperately need significant capital reconstruction and renewal. So that's really what that is. I think expansion is a misnomer in this instance. So we're really looking at a major project at our central transportation yard with what's identified here. The land acquisitions largely are intended to service our proposed future Cold Springs area high school. And we'll talk about that later in this presentation. But in the past, this committee's approved specific land acquisition budget allowances for other strategic purchases of property. We're in very good shape as far as that's concerned, having acquired or have agreements in place for acquiring those properties in the future, but it's anticipated that land acquisition associated with the high school in Cold Springs will be needed within this time frame. Similarly, the Cold Springs High School itself, we're going to talk in depth about the timing of that and why that is later, but the initial design funding for this project is anticipated in this 5-year horizon. And then, last but not least here within the major projects is this elementary school to be determined. We'll talk about some details around that in a moment, but that is very much anticipated in this time horizon to be designed and constructed in time for the 25-26 school year. Moving out of order a little bit, but top to bottom, that comprehensive modernization study we'll talk about more later, and those next 3 line items are intentionally generic in nature. That study is intended to inform that detail, but modeling this in a way to represent this level of investment in these categories of projects is financially feasible within this term and with all the assumptions that we've made. It's that study that we want to engage in, and we'll talk about later, that will inform those line items with specific projects in years to come. We do have a line item associated with central services offices, a much discussed, little progressed need of the district, similar overcrowding concerns, leased facilities continuing to drain on the district. That's out in year 5. And then somewhat out of order, priority-wise, we've got a line item for the capital renewal program. I'll point out that ticks up in year 2 and beyond, and that's something that we've modeled, carried over from last year, really to affect inflation and really just keep up with the needs of all of our facilities. What the last year and this year was a $40 million total. This is capital investments only, less admin and program administration expenses, moving up to a $50 million annual total in years 2 through 5. So like I kept on saying, we'll talk about these more later, and we will, but hopefully this helps you sort of put those categories of projects into context. We've got major projects, we've got capital renewal, and we've got existing school investments here. This second page of these expenditures, moving on to slide 10, a couple line items to point out as well. IT device refresh as a part of our CIP and total CIP expenditures is modeled here. We've got program administration line items. We've got fleet purchase items. Those are sort of renewal program for school buses, not expanding our fleet per se, but just replacing aging and beyond their useful lifespan type of assets. And then the transfer to debt service funds at the bottom, kind of rounding out the modeled expenditures. So any questions on these 2 slides? A good amount more detail to come on many of these line items.
Elise Bonkowski for the record. I just want to put some concerns as the community member at large surrounding the transportation and IT. I think the staffing behind this is very critical. I personally forgot my kids at school on Monday, so we did not have bus services this week. So you know, I think it would be responsible to make sure that the staffing situations get handled first before the actual spending goes into place, to make sure that our kids are safe and they're getting to school on time, especially as well with the IT devices. I personally have a son and I thank Adam for having this discussion with me. He gets through the firewalls very easily and goes onto social media platforms. So I want to make sure that the IT staff is also properly equipped to handle these items for them. Thank you.
Justin Ivory for the record. Adam, on the fleet purchase, I see you've got, was it 3.4 million in each year for the next 4 years, and up to 3.5. And I'm just going back to historical. What did we do? I know we approved some. I didn't think it was last year, but perhaps it was last year. Did we do a refresh for transportation where we bought some buses?
I believe last year was the first year where we included this line item within the overall CIP, and I believe it was at the same level, or the same dollar amount.
And do you recall if when we did that, if part of the conversation was we're going to be doing this every year moving forward? Because the only reason I say is I know that, like you say, this is the first year we did it, and then we always kind of fall into this kind of gray area as to what is capital funding versus what is not. A lot of times you can look back at it historically. Where did the buses get paid for? Out of what fund did the buses get paid for, say, 10 or 15 years ago? And I'm not sure, I guess, I guess when we kind of agreed to allow that last time, I guess I wasn't under the impression that this was going to be a yearly expenditure of 3.4 million, I guess.
So Mark Mathers, Chief Financial Officer. I do believe it was depicted last year in the CIP that this would be an ongoing replacement of our yellow bus fleet, as well as a few white fleet vehicles. I do think we showed it every year, and that's the intention. We're behind in terms of replacement of buses. We're on more than a 15-year cycle, and buses don't generally last longer than that. So, we do have a rolling purchase program. It's like basically buying a car. We have a term of 4 to 5 years in which we're purchasing those buses. So that I do believe that's how it was shown last year as well.
Okay, then let me test you one more. How did we pay for it 10 years ago?
I wasn't here 10 years ago. I believe it was the general fund.
So up until last year, it was the general fund that paid for buses. Was it last year or the year before? In the last couple of years, it was the general fund that typically paid for buses.
Yes, sir. And what we had seen was we were spending even lower than $3 million. And, part of the decision, so first of all, let me clarify, we are not using property tax or WC1 monies to purchase these buses. The debt service on these medium-term notes are coming out of our government services tax fund. And I'm not sure that was always included in the CIP that this committee has seen, but at some point we decided, that is a capital project fund, and it's appropriate for you to see that. So I don't exactly recall when we started doing that, but basically we had seen, because of the demands on the general fund and our historical budget deficit, a real diminishment of the program to replace buses. And what we were able to monetize was the increased growth in our GST revenues. So we didn't impact what we had spent and what we do spend out of the GST fund on actual repairs and other capital projects, but use that growth that we had seen to up the replacement of our buses. So that was kind of the formulation we brought to our board and that they approved.
Okay, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, through that same funding source is also where we do the IT refresh. Is that correct?
Mark Mathers, Chief Financial Officer for the record. No, the actual IT refresh is paid out of property tax pay-as-you-go money that we do receive, and it's contingent on being able to pay debt service on our rollover bonds. So only any extra money that comes in that year from the property tax debt rate the school district receives would be transferred to the property tax pay-as-you-go fund to pay for IT devices. So that is not GST. That was actually property tax monies.
And so I'm understanding then the GST, this is actually, when we're paying for fleet services or fleet purchases, this is actually in excess of what we typically say 10 years ago when we didn't pay for buses through capital improvement and we paid it through general fund. The GST has actually increased enough since then to actually pay for this portion of it. Are we splitting that money amongst anything else on this list, or is that extra money going just towards fleet purchases?
It may have also, I'd have to check the attachment, the attached CIP. There is a page for the GST fund. We may also, it's for fleet, but we may also be paying for the line item that with the closed circuit TV and cameras on our buses. But I would need to check that attachment. But I believe the GST fund is also being used to pay for that $250,000 a year expense.
Okay, and then just one last one.
But your question, you're absolutely right in your description of the GST growth, and
We're paying for it from the cream on the top that we didn't have before.
that's right. That's exactly right.
So then the only other question I've got then is, do we anticipate that in year 6, 7, 8, and forever known, are we going to always be paying $3.5 million roughly, and then 3.6, and then 3.7 for perpetuity, for forever? Is that what we're doing with the buses?
Well, we don't expect a decrease in the number of buses the district needs. But if that were to happen, that might reduce it. I guess I would say to you, if we saw the state come through and actually fund school districts at a level we felt was more appropriate, there's always the possibility if resources from the state increase that we could shift back to the general fund, at least contributing to the replacement of our buses. We haven't seen that. To give you a little sense of things, this is kind of the yin and the yang, the best and worst worlds on the capital improvement program. We do have adequate resources to fund all these needs. In terms of our operating budget, our revenues will go up at most 1.3% in fiscal year 23. So we're not being funded to be able to do that, but I hope that someday we are, and then you might see, again, kind of reevaluating the funding sources.
I think kind of where I'm going with this is I just want to make sure so that, because I kind of understand putting fleet services in capital improvement. Okay, I kind of understand how you get there. What I wouldn't want to see as a member of this committee is a change then in year 8 where we say, well, we've got this money, we've got to spend it or we don't get to use it, and so what we've done is we've decreased the age of a bus from, say, we usually get 12 years for the last 12 years or whatever, we're getting 12 years per bus, that we've changed it to 8 and we're replacing perfectly good buses. That would be my concern moving forward, that if I don't know, I'm big on the historical stuff because it helps us to remind us why we did or why we're doing what we're doing. So it seems to me like if we're spending $3.4 or $3.5 million, it's not like the IT refresh course, because the IT stuff only lasts 5 years. The bus should last 10 to 15 years. I mean, if maintained properly. So that's my 2 cents, and I'll be done.
Actually, Member Cardinal had, nope, good, okay, Member Whitey, go ahead.
Not to beat a dead horse, but kind of in following what Mr. Ivory was saying, I guess to put it in perspective for me, because I know we do fleet also for the city. I think both cities, county do. 3.5 million per year sounds like a lot of money, which it is. But how how much does one bus cost? Are these leased or purchased? And then how long is the longevity? And on the fleet, like with our fleet, whether it's fire, police, or whatever, we estimate how, when we're going to need to replace, kind of the shelf life, if you may, on each of your buses. And then you rotate, so 10 years from now, when we bought a new one this year, it would be, so to give me a perspective, kind of what is the cost of those buses and how often are you replacing? And I would agree that I don't want to see money in a fund that just has to be spent and we might not need it at that point. So we're looking at 5 years right now. I get that, but I'm trying to get a perspective of 3.5 million, how many buses that means and how many we're looking at replacing every year in this plan.
So thank you for the questions. So we've seen tremendous inflation on the prices of buses this year. Until this year, a bus would cost roughly $150,000. We have more than 300 buses in our fleet. Again, the useful life of a bus might be 12 to 15 years. We, in my last conversation with the Transportation Department, based on this level of funding, we're more on a 20-year replacement cycle, which may cause us problems in the future for sure. So we're far away from being on an 8-year replacement cycle, and I would want to assure you we'll never get to the point where we're just refreshing buses prior to the end of their useful life. That would not happen. But again, we're very far away from that.
Just had a comment on this. One of the things, and I appreciate you bringing all the CIP items so that we're seeing those. But what I'm wondering, is there a way that you in the future can actually add in the budget information for us? Which fund specifically is this coming from? Is that actually in the document and I missed it? Okay, thank you.
Yes, there's the actual capital improvement program document, which is basically a series of spreadsheets. I don't know, is that attachment B, or I don't know how that's labeled in their packet.
It should be attached in your packet.
So there's a summary at the front, like what you see here, basically.
Yep,
We
these
cut
two
and
slides.
copied and pasted this into the PowerPoint. And then after those first 3 pages, you can see kind of in the top left a fund number and the fund name. So you can actually see what each fund is paying for. So there's your detail. So you can see on the Government Services Tax Fund 40, which is near the end, the kinds of expenses that is covering.
Awesome, thank you. I missed the fund number up in the corner there. That's good information. Thank you.
I apologize, Justin Ivory for the record. So obviously, I've agreed to fleet purchases being a capital improvement, but I'm maybe going to need a little bit of help. I know they're not big numbers, but I'm going to need a little bit of help with body cameras and fleet bus cameras and shared radio systems on how that's a capital improvement.
So Mark Mathers, Chief Financial Officer, they do cross over the threshold of a capital expense. And I'm sorry, I'm looking for the funding sources. Certainly the body cameras are reimbursed from the county's E911 fund, so that is a net cost of $0. The cameras on the buses we broke that out from the actual bus purchases. That's something we have to have for our buses. So that's kind of just part and parcel of operating a yellow bus in the school system.
I think we could note that the shared radio system is the upgraded regional radio system that all of the agencies are being required to migrate to. You'll note that's a one-time expense. I think we've paid on that several years, but this looks to be our final contribution. So that's really a part of our public infrastructure, not necessarily related to exclusively the school bus radios, but emergency responder radios for our school police and even our school administrators across the district. That's something that all emergency agencies are a part of here in this region.
I have a response that might help you, Justin, on the fleet buses, CCTV and cameras. So in accounting, in the capital project world, any expense that goes toward bringing that asset online is considered part of the capital project or the capital asset. So to me, this seems okay to be included, you know, if we agree that school bus is a capital asset, because it's part of bringing that bus online. So.
And that certainly answers,
Thanks for the discussion, folks. The next slide is just a pie graph depiction of the distribution of those investments. So, you know, I think a nice visual takeaway of where these funds are being invested across our CIP in the next 5 years. Slide 12, again, you'll see those three major categories of projects and some sub-bullets as to what those really mean and how we go about informing the projects that are included within these categories. I won't read them to you, but it kind of sets the stage for our thinking on these next projects. This is a 5-year I'm sorry, which slide? The pie graph? Oh, yeah.
So, Mr. Mathers, you talked about having... Thank you, Councilman. Mr. Mathers, you talked about having a 25% buffer between sales tax to cover debt service. And I'm looking at the debt service, 194 million on this slide. Are you guys comfortable with that level? How does that compare with debt service, say, for Washoe County or Sparks or City of Reno, percentage-wise? I don't know if 18% is a healthy number. I just looking for some comparison.
Yeah, I did work for the county once upon a time. So the statutes we operate under are different for municipalities versus school districts. But so municipalities are constrained by the kinds of revenue sources they can pledge for debt service, and they don't have a WC1 fund. I'm trying to answer this quickly, trust me. A 25% coverage factor is very, very healthy. I mean, it's something the rating agencies look at and appreciate very much, having that level of coverage. You might see 10% coverage factor normally for a garden variety revenue, if there is such a thing, in the debt service that's pledged off of that revenue. So again, based on kind of the historical volatility of sales tax, we just internally feel comfortable with a really high level of coverage. And with that money that comes in that terms of that coverage, that can be used for pay-as-you-go projects. So as you'll see, we've built 2 schools through pay-as-you-go and avoid interest altogether. So it is being deployed, that buffer, to build schools. So it is a high coverage factor, but I can't say offhand what Reno or Sparks or the county where their debt is necessarily at.
Okay, but you guys feel good about it?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, just continuing on, we were at slide 13, where we wanted to make the point with this slide that while we're depicting the 5-year CIP in detail, that a 10 and 20-year horizon absolutely were included in the planning and the long-term thinking. So you may recall a little over a year ago that we brought through this committee to the regional planning governing board and ultimately the board of trustees our 20-year facilities plan. But within that 10-year horizon as well, you know, we're going to talk about a little bit about that potential new high school in the Cold Springs area. We certainly anticipate ongoing growth throughout the community and the need for new schools and other major projects within that 5 to 10-year horizon. And that was considered as well. And really what's before us today is that required 5-year horizon. And then always worth a shout out, because that 20-year horizon, this long-term facilities plan is very important to the regional planning agency and other regional public agencies in terms of those types of long-term horizon planning. And we just wanted to take the opportunity to reiterate that. So this is a slide that was presented to the Board of Trustees several months ago, but not the Capital Funding Protection Committee. It was part of a different special meeting of the Board of Trustees, but it's got a lot of information on it. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but some really, I think, striking pieces of fact and information. These really represent somewhat recent trends and somewhat medium-term trends that represent a bit of, we'll call them headwinds with respect to enrollment projections or enrollment demands. Birth rates continue to decrease countywide. This is a per capita birth rate. And we're going to talk more later about this enrollment bubble that are now largely sophomores across the district. We talk about development. There's tremendous development throughout the community. However, those individuals are not generating students at the same per capita rate that they have historically. That's a long-term trend, declining 30% within the last decade, and it's like a per household student generation rate. Charter schools, a relatively newer term trend, but a significant influx of charters throughout the community that has made an impact on our overall enrollment numbers. And then, of course, COVID is still an evolving saga, but through the 21-22 school year, we've seen a net decrease district-wide that has not returned to the public school system. So all of this is just to help the committee and the public understand some of the information that we use to develop these types of capital project recommendations. This is the enrollment bubble. This is also a slide that the board has seen before, but I felt it was really important that as many people as possible see it. In essence, you're seeing a larger, these are district-wide enrollment numbers, current district-wide enrollment numbers, and what's projected to occur is when those current 8th, 9th, and 10th graders graduate, and when likely smaller grade levels replace them in the kindergarten end of this bar chart, you're going to see the district-wide enrollment decrease year over year. So that's something that we're anticipating, and you'll see reflected in all of our projections. So moving into a little bit more detail on a couple of the specific projects, major projects that were highlighted in the CIP, we'll move up into the North Spanish Springs area and what was previously referred to as a to-be-determined elementary school number 5. We're going to plant the flag on our 10-acre property in the Stonebrook development. This is a screenshot from a presentation we made to the Capital Funding Protection Committee in 2018, where authorization was made for us to purchase this property. As many of you know, this property's been surrounded by residential development rapidly since that time, and we're tracking growth in enrollment numbers and anticipating the need to construct a school on that property within this 5-year time period. This graph on slide 17 illustrates the current and projected enrollment levels relative to capacity of all of these 7 elementary schools up there through the 10-year horizon. And what this CIP proposes is that we currently anticipate a need to open a new school in that Stonebrook community before the 25-26 school year. We'll go through a similar process likely to what we all just experienced with Polakitas and the new Jaywood Raw Elementary School, where we're looking to time that precisely, placing portable classrooms to expand the ability of Bohatch in particular to field this enrollment growth until a point which a new school is truly warranted, and then we'll bring forward proposal to initiate construction. Right now, again, the CIP is projecting that we'll need this school by August 2025. So transitioning to the other most significant major project in the CIP, a little bit more about this proposed Cold Springs area high school. So the bullet point here, enrollment increases will be muted by rezoning and other factors. If you look closely, these are the current enrollments and projections at North Valleys High School through the 10-year horizon. And you can see them dip over the next 5-year term and then increase somewhat steeply throughout the remainder of the decade. And there's some reasons why the projections look like that. I'm going to walk through for a second. First off is an previously approved enrollment boundary rezoning that's been through the Zoning Advisory Committee. The public and the Board of Trustees have approved this effective next school year. So that area sort of highlighted there, largely Panther Valley, will be rezoned to the new Proctor Hug School starting next school year. And that's anticipated to take between 100 and 150 students out of North Valleys High School as soon as next school year, roughly 5% of their total student body moving to the new Hug High School. Next slide, we talk about the impacts of the next new high school, Debbie Smith CTE High School, to open August 2024. This pie chart was used in our rezoning meetings to depict the current distribution. This is actually the current distribution of enrollment at AACT. And we basically just assumed that a similar distribution of zone students would open enroll at this career and technical high school. Following that logic, at approximately 13% of the future 900 to 950 enrollment at the W. Smith CTE Academy, that also equates to approximately 125 students who would be otherwise zoned for North Valleys High School, who will be open enrolling at the new W. Smith CTE High School. So again, 2024 anticipating some decrease to that North Valleys High School enrollment demand. This is the same sort of bubble curve, but just focused on that enrollment at North Valleys High School vertical feeder enrollment. So the numbers are different, but that same phenomenon is expected to be felt by North Valleys High School through 23-24, 24-25, and 25-26, somewhere on the order of a net 50 students per year coming out of that vertical that feeds North Valleys High School, approximately another minus 5% total enrollment demand on North Valleys through that term. These are competing variables pushing back against the enrollment growth that development is causing in the area that we're all familiar with. So speaking of that, there of course are many developments under construction in the North Valleys, but when we talk in terms of student generation rates and actually how many homes and new population numbers are necessary to warrant a new high school, we monitor this very closely. This is a snapshot from the UNR Center for Regional Studies that informs a lot of the projections that we make, and you can see a lot of that red. Most notably, the Stonegate community has not yet broken ground, and that's the type of major activity that will tip the scales towards moving this project forward. We're monitoring this very, very closely, but of course, from groundbreaking to significant student generation is a multiple, upwards of 5 years. It's just another variable that we monitor in this complex situation to time our projects. This slide, moving quickly, tries to talk a little bit about the geographic nature of this enrollment boundary. So you can see the student enrollment boundaries for the various high schools there, as opposed to the new Hug, where we were able to move the old Hug students into that school, rezone some kids out of North Valleys, rezone some kids out of Spanish Springs to fill that school on day one. In the North Valleys, it's more of a zero-sum type of proposal, and what ultimately it will likely result in is a bit of a phased initial construction up there. So if many of you are familiar with Damani Ranch High School, it opened, and then ultimately as that community built out was expanded, it's anticipated that that type of a solution would be warranted up here. We would, of course, build out the permanent structure with the athletic facilities and parking lots and things of that nature, but master plan it such that we could expand it when the demand fully materializes well after the first day of school. So just a noteworthy variable, because this, it's a very important project, a very significant project, but a variety of complicated variables that inform the timing on this very carefully. So this is just a concept drawing, very, very schematic, but it's intended to demonstrate the level of forethought that we have put into this. A lot of collaboration. This was done in partnership with the Stonegate developers. To get your bearings, that's US 395 there, kind of on the lower end of the drawing, and White Lake Parkway. On the north side of US 395 there's a large kind of triangular piece of property that's going to be a part of the Stonegate community. And really the high school has always been master planned into their development there as a bit of an anchor tenant. So thinking about the adjacencies and what types of development wants to be near and around a high school, this is the type of forethought that has been put into the project. But at this time, we're really still a couple of years away from initiating any land acquisition or significant design work. So in conclusion, really on this aspect of the CIP, it does take upwards of 5 years from the start of design to the first day of school to get these projects really to our students. And so, pegging that, as opposed to an elementary school that we can be a little bit more nimble on, pegging that timing just right is something that we are spending a lot of time considering. And right now our proposal is to begin that design in 2026, which is what's reflected in this CIP. That would equate to major construction in 2028 and an approximate opening of August 2030. And as with all aspects of this CIP, this will be reevaluated annually. So as circumstances change, we will have the ability to adjust the timing on this appropriately. So a few more slides I'd like to get through, but any question or discussion on those deep dives? These core school investment projects are a big part of the CIP. Some of these bullets you've seen before, but really we're at a point as a district and as a capital projects department where the pent-up overcrowding has largely been addressed. We remain in a position to meet the needs of future growth in a healthy and sustainable way while continuing to replace outdated and worn out aspects of our facility, and are well positioned to now address this existing school investments program that was always a part of the WC1 program, but after addressing those other priorities a little bit more urgently, are proposing to take a very strong turn towards this initiative to provide a more equitable level of facility across all of our existing schools in the district. That's what this is proposed to tackle. The next couple slides have a lot of specific detail over the ages and the types of our schools. Most of you are familiar with many of these. We affectionately like to kind of group them with nicknames, but these similar style schools you'll recognize largely up at the top. I tried to characterize these by the total number of schools across the district of this type. In this case, 20 of these baby boomer era elementary schools, the average age of which are 60 years across these 20 schools. So that's one of the more extreme examples, but all of the different school types and grouped largely by age can be found on slide 27. Slide 28, even more detail on these schools. You'll note in particular kind of the modest increase in size over the years. I think that's the most noteworthy. When you go into these schools, if you're familiar with Dilworth or Sparks Middle or Vaughan or Duncan or schools, 60-year-old schools of that nature, they all have 20 classrooms or however many classrooms there. They're all approximately the same size classrooms, but it's those music rooms, those libraries, those group spaces that our current schools, our most modern schools, our educational specifications have across the district that these schools don't have. Even administrative spaces, things that really weren't a necessary part of a school environment or believed to be a necessary part of the school environment in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that very much are today. And those spaces are not allocated or available in these types of facilities. Those are some of the equity-related improvements, as well as just the absolute age, the extreme age of some of these schools. You see there Vaughn turning 66 years old in 2022. And really, over the past several years, we've embarked on a few projects that have informed us tremendously on these types of opportunities. Most notably, Swope and O'Brien. We're embarking on major core school investments on both of those campuses. But even in the early 2000s, some of you might remember a program we termed as revitalizations, where we went into some of these older schools and a smaller scale, but made significant improvements into those classroom spaces. All of this information has been informing our planning process as we develop this CIP, but the more we've done in-house, the more we've learned that this needs to really bear the benefit from an external review and community engagement. This is potentially a program, as you saw before, in excess of $100 million per year across our district. And as exciting as that is, ultimately, you always have to make tough decisions. Somebody has to go second and third and fourth, and not every school will warrant the same level of investment. And that needs to be very thoroughly discussed and publicly debated. Both quantitative and qualitative assessment should inform this. Students, teachers, parents, as well as subject matter experts, all in a transparent process. Really, we're going to see that recommendation later, but the anticipation of a district-wide study to determine the specific elements of this program is where we see this going next. But anticipating the resources to deliver on these types of investments across our district is extremely exciting. Not only to relieve this isn't a project to relieve overcrowding. This is to create parity across all of our school facilities and reinvest in the communities that they serve. It's something that I think we're all looking forward to jumping into later this year. So that's kind of the end of this. There's just a few more slides on capital renewal and a bit more on our financial resources. Any questions on our core school investments?
Justin Ivory, for the record. Adam, you talk about $100 million being spent per year. Just so that I can clarify, is that pay-as-you-go money or is that bonded money?
That'll largely be bonded money. The only time we can really save up enough money for construction of a new school is an elementary school. So it's possible part of this could be, but we've kind of modeled it more on a debt financing kind of plan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving ahead, we've got a couple of slides here to note capital renewal. It's maybe more boring, but the most significant aspect of our program. We're pumping out over 100 projects across every school in the district every year, 20,000, 50,000, 500,000. These are very impactful to our existing schools, and you'll see this in deep detail in our June meeting. But as a part of this CIP, it's a single line item at $40 million a year for FY23. And as we discussed previously, there are also other components to the CIP informed through our facility condition index system, communicated to the public through our data gallery, also inclusive of transportation, police and safety, and IT devices. We've got a couple more slides to help the community better understand our resources and projected funding.
Yep. So thank you, Adam. I understand there have been some questions in the past about our ability to fund projects, and so we inserted a few charts here to, again, try to address those questions. We worked with the consultant who worked with the PSORN committee to kind of document, again, what were the assumptions back when that committee met. And so this slide just tries to show you that actual resources, even in a period of 2 years less than that initial 7-year period PSORN looked at, have exceeded projections. And certainly revenues have been far greater than what was assumed, and those weren't bad assumptions back in 2015 and 2016. But again, sales tax revenues have grown on a compounded annual rate of 8.75%, and property taxes nearly double the assumption of 3% at 6%. So, I know we've seen construction inflation, but the good news is we've seen revenue inflation, if you will, as well, that more than covered that. So it has worked out and been better than what, again, that committee projected out. You saw this chart last year, just again to demonstrate the phenomenal, amazing growth in WC1 sales tax revenues. If you were to drill down, there were only 2 months where we haven't seen year-over-year growth in a single month, and those were at the beginning of COVID in March of fiscal year 21, which would have been March of 20 and April of 20. In May of 20 was slightly less, but basically right on top of the prior year. And since then, revenues have exceeded the prior year's month by 700,000 to 900,000 a month. So it's just been phenomenal, which is great news in terms of providing the resources for this plan. Again, trying to address, I think, a question about, are we overspending resources? So I wanted to, the next 2 charts, compare incoming sources versus outgoing uses. So this tracks WC1 sales taxes and expenses from expenditures from fiscal year 18 through 22. Amazingly, I didn't total the revenue and expenditure lines. Sorry, Sophie. Maybe you're going to ask about that. Yeah, sorry about that. Shame on me. But I didn't ask about your coverage for Tomlin's bonds. So yeah. Anyhow, total sales tax revenues over this 5-year period, including the budgeted numbers for the current year, were $251 million, and we spent $200 million. So revenues exceeded expenditures by more than $50 million. And then the next slide shows you kind of the same comparison for property taxes. Again, sorry for not subtotaling revenues and expenditures, but total revenues over the 5-year period have been $325 million, and total expenditures have been $295 million. So that has resulted in not excess, but a variance of $30 million. Those excess revenues have gone into our fund balance. So they're there for future projects, or certainly as a reserve in case of a worst case scenario, another Great Recession. So again, we carefully budget and monitor and never want to overspend. Going back, I'm sorry, to the prior slide though, you can see where in the WC1 sales tax funds, as funds build up, we do use those monies to build elementary schools on a pay-as-you-go basis where we can. So in fiscal year 20, we built Bow Hatch using available fund balance, and same with Rio Wrangler J. Wood-Raw Elementary School. We're using cash to pay for that. So, that's basically, kind of the mode we've been in. We're very comfortable with these revenues. In terms of a couple slides. We saw our credit rating raised a couple years ago after it had been lowered. We are a AA credit. The credit rating agencies feel very good about kind of our situation. Again, we have significant reserves covering almost 9 months of debt service now at this point, strong coverage. And until recently, interest rates were far below our assumptions for these models. We have seen a major backup in interest rates because of the Fed's kind of signaling to the markets. But again, very strong in terms of our capital funding revenue sources. So I wanted to do that to address any concerns you might have about our ability to pay this debt.
Okay, so just one last conclusion slide. Really, a couple of these points have been made already, but the point that major existing school overcrowding has largely been addressed represents that turning point really for our program, that since the passage of WC1, it's been breakneck pace to add capacity and relieve that overcrowding, and that now we're in a position to transition to another chapter in this post-WC1 era of the CIP. And really that exists within our core schools, our existing schools that have abundant needs across the district. We're proposing to conduct a thorough study to inform exactly how and when to invest those types of resources, which gratefully exist and are projected to persist into the year's future. This is an annual program that gets revisited every year. We will need to return to the committee for actual project-specific authorizations, and we will have flexibility within that core school investments element also, should somehow the revenues fall short of what's projected or the demands increase on a capacity side. The flexibility in the timing and scale of those core school investments projects is significant, but based on our best projections, we anticipate a CIP that will allow us to make those types of improvements across all of our district. So thank you for the discussion and for listening to this lengthy presentation. The recommendation on this item, actually, not later, is to forward this for approval to the Board of Trustees. Thank you.
Any further comments, questions, needs of the committee? Go ahead.
Justin Ivory for the record. I know you're saying that there's the, I guess maybe I'm not clear or wasn't understanding it correctly, but in this, it kind of shows us spending almost all of our money, but what about the unforeseen major expenditure that comes up? Is it just that we would take one of these and push it out? Would that be the answer, I guess? If something came up that we didn't, obviously it's unforeseen, so we don't know what it is yet, but if it came up, we didn't see what it was, we would just push one of these out. Would that be the game plan?
I think what I was trying to imply with that last narrative was that the timing and motivation of those existing school investments has a greater degree of flexibility than a new school suffering or to relieve severe overcrowding. If for some reason revenues or demands indicated or required that we accelerate a major project or a new school, those existing school investments could conceivably be delayed or modified in some fashion. There's more variability there. It just further, in addition to the coverage and the effort put into our projections, that is just to further reassure that if some significant unforeseen occurs, we have the ability to be flexible there as well.
And maybe to clarify as well, I didn't want to give you the impression that we have utilized all funding. We haven't. There is a remaining bonding capacity in both our rollover bond program and our WC1 bond program. So we did not maximize the use of the resources and build out to our total ability to fund. We kind of wanted to stop here, and again, that modernization study is so important in terms of providing the guidance going forward. But I did want to clarify, we're not spending every dollar in this plan, and I recognize you kind of can't see that, but we are not going up to our coverage thresholds that are available to us. So again, as significant rollover bonds roll off, there is the ability to do additional financing in years 6 through 10, which you don't see here, right? So this is a 5-year plan per state law. But there is additional capacity built into our planning. Again, in a worst case scenario, Adam's right. We could always push back projects. The one thing that we talk about a lot is never getting over our skis and overcommitting so that we can't build a new school if there is more growth than what we projected. The first priority is to keep our some powder dry to build new schools to address growth-related demands. And then to the extent we have money remaining for what we anticipate for that in growth, that would be available for these core school investments. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit for you. Again, we don't want to spend every last dollar, and this plan does not do that.
Okay, so it absolutely does, and I appreciate that. So if we're spending $800 million over the next 5 years through this plan, right? Is that what I'm seeing basically? What would be, not a number I'm going to hold you to, but what would be our max?
Well, it depends. I mean, you can move up your bonding needs up, but then that'll mean you have less in years 6 through 10. So I really can't answer it. A 5-year window is a long period of time for sure, but the term of our debt is 20 to 30 years. So I can't really say that, because whatever you move up will mean that much less potentially you have to spend in the second half of a 10-year plan. Again, I think the modernization study will help drive a lot of the future planning, and we don't have that study completed yet. I think by next year's time, our hope is that we have that plan in place and can actually talk about the phasing of projects much more specifically and in a much more informed way. So I think that would be the opportunity to have those kind of discussions. Hey, can we accelerate? Do we need to push back? And so forth. But again, we don't want to spend every last dollar on core school investments. We've got to preserve some funding for new schools in developing, growing areas like Cold Springs.
All right. Since this is an action item, is there any public comment on this?
There is not.
All right. With that, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion. I move to approve the proposed capital, you just took it off the screen. I move to approve the capital improvement plan 5-year CIP for 2023 to 2027.
Sophie Cardinal, I second.
Got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries unanimously. All right, thank you very much. That'll take us on to item 2.05, is a presentation and discussion on the development of a comprehensive modernization study. Mr. Searcy.
Thank you. We've spoken a good bit about this so far this evening. Attached to this item is an excerpt from the RFQ that is being published related to these services. So I won't read this in depth, but because this is a significant budgetary recommendation, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what we anticipate this process entailing. In essence, as I've described a little bit this evening, this is proposed to be a district-wide study inclusive of all of our existing school buildings, something that goes into a significant amount of detail with a wide variety of data. Our school facility conditions themselves, our projected enrollment and capacities of those schools, a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of the floor plans relative to our most modern current standard school facilities. And this, of course, is across a wide range of school types. You've got the 1990s era elementary schools, the 1980s era, if you will, and the 1960s era elementary schools, all significantly different, and ultimately striving to compare their deficiencies, if you will, to our most current schools, and then devise architectural solutions to create greater parity, inform those solutions with budgets associated at a high level, and then also make recommendations with respect to prioritization. I think it's going to be, and that may end up being much a good bit of a qualitative discussion, you know, because as I mentioned earlier, it's I think easy for a lot of us to imagine Sparks Middle, Dilworth Middle, and Trainer are all very, very similar in age and very, very similar in floor plan, are all very, very deserving of significant investments, but somebody is likely needing to go first, and they may not all warrant exactly the same scope of investment. So that's just a summary of the level of detail that we'll be requesting of this consultant. We're also going to be expecting a very inclusive process. So think subcommittees, internal subcommittees, think public town halls where we're going out to the community, engaging with them on what they feel is most important to be needed and why, and taking that information then also back to this committee and back to the Board of Trustees. Our ultimate objective is to have that process completed and fully endorsed by our board in time, approximately this time next year, to inform the next CIP with specific schools and scopes and budgets that we can, fill out this program of core school investments with specific projects, not just to be determined type of information. So I think that's a summary. I won't reread through this excerpt of the scope, but again, on the next item, 2.06, we are recommending a budgetary allocation of $2 million to put towards this study. Again, we feel that's conservative to achieve this. It will be a qualifications-based solicitation through which we'll negotiate the final scope and fee. You'll also note in the 5-year CIP there are preliminary design funds identified. We're not asking for authorization on those tonight, but the logic there, just for the purposes of discussion, is that should projects rise to the top very prominently through this process, that rather than waiting until the next fiscal year to have the budgetary resources to move forward, that we wanted to reserve several million in each of those elementary, middle, and high school categories to pursue projects that really look to be urgently desired by the community and through this process. But the recommendation tonight is only for the budget associated with this study, and we're anticipating the bulk of it be through the latter half or quarter of this calendar year, likely spilling into 2023 with those final recommendations and endorsements to inform next fiscal year's CIP. So I think that's the summary on this. This one was just for discussion, but we felt like we wanted to highlight this as it does come with a significant budgetary recommendation.
Go ahead.
So just a comment, not a question. So in 2016, when the community was considering whether to pass WC1, one of the big, posters or, one of the things that would go out to the community was pictures of dilapidated mobile classroom units. And 5.5 years ago was when this community passed WC1. And for me, when I drive around our community, there's still several schools that have those units. And I don't know if it falls under reconstruction or renovation on your list of things, but I would just ask, as a committee member who's been on this committee for a few years now, let's take a hard look at that, because, I think this community was under the assumption that those would have been taken care of by now. And, whenever I come off this committee, if there is still a single mobile unit classroom in this district, that's going to be a huge regret of mine personally, that did not get addressed while I served on this committee. So that's just a comment, not a question, but I just wanted to put a bug in your guys' ear about that.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charlene Bybee, for the record. And I would kind of echo what Andrew is saying. When we were all promoting and working on WC1, the intent for sure was overcrowding and building new schools, but just as important was all the older schools. And some of these, I look at the dates, and my kids went to Mendive, and it was only a couple of years old. So to show, it's 22 years old. I haven't aged, but oh my gosh, I have to think about how long ago my kids were there. And that's a new school to me, is Mendive. And it's still 22 years old. So, but I guess my question on looking for, putting out an RFP for, an innovative firm to investigate current conditions, is it because we've got so much work that we're doing that internally, and I know how much work you have done, Mr. Searcy, and the school district itself has always looked at where the funding for, not just all the new, but how much we have put in from the bonds, from the, rollover bonds to WC1 money. We are constantly looking at refresh, whether it's buses, computers, the facilities themselves. So we've been doing that the whole time. Is the purpose of putting this out for, the whole district-wide facilities plan to have a new set of eyes or innovative approaches to really how we get there, because we don't feel like we can do that right now, or we want some new ideas from someone outside that can come in and look at that. I'm struggling with, it absolutely needs to be done. I mean, we need to figure out, and I think all of us know that our goal all along was to try to give those older schools, upgrades that won't ever, they won't match up to what those brand new schools are, but what can we give them to improve those facilities the best we can, and their educational, performances in those schools has been critical to the extent that we can. So I guess I'm really kind of looking for, why are we going outside to do that instead of continuing? Do you think we'll get better answers and a better plan to move forward with?
I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this a little bit, because this was something that we've spent a fair bit of time on. I mean, the CIP that we saw, or that we approved here earlier this afternoon, shows, call it rolled up line items of elementary, middle, and high. Internally, we have attempted to identify schools by name and type and budget and schedule. In doing so, we learned that there are going to be some very, very difficult decisions that need to be made on that program of projects, and also that in order to make those decisions, it is truly necessary to have a process, a more inclusive, community-engaged process with more voices and more perspectives considered. And in doing that, we also did converse with industry experts and nationwide consultants who have performed this type of scope for other school districts across the country, and had our eyes opened in a few instances to solutions and approaches and depiction that we felt would absolutely add value to the end product. And then I guess last but not least, really just looking at the scale of this program at over $100 million per year, and that's sort of leveled, right? Some years might be higher, some years be lower, but for the purpose of the CIP at this point, we leveled it and rolled it up. That this community really, I think, deserves a third-party look at it, done with that level of professional care. The fortunate thing for them, the school district has a significant amount of institutional knowledge and existing data to inform that consultant that will be facilitating these conversations. They'll be K-12 architectural experts, which I like to think we have a pretty good idea on what some of the recommendations would be. But I mean, I think many of us have been a part of or participated in studies of this nature, and sometimes it's nice to hear, well, put it another way. I thought I knew some of the answers, and too many times somebody else came to me with a better idea, enough times to realize that what I thought was the right plan could definitely stand to be improved. So on a program of this scale, that's why we're bringing forth this recommendation, because we want to make it as good of a process and a plan as possible, and that external experts, we think, are warranted in this case.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of along the same lines, not being in the school building and upkeep side of things, to me, this is the scope of work is the breadth and width is so great. Obviously, you need an organization that's good at this. Are we talking about 5 organizations that would potentially bid it, or are we talking 50? Or, I mean, I'm just wondering, because this seems like such a niche. What kind of competition will we have in the bidding process looking for a company to perform this?
You know, we've spoken with 3 or 4 national architectural firms who have performed this type of scope for a variety of major school districts across the nation over the last several months, just to help us inform this RFP. It's been published in a variety of national trade publications. So, it's a significant undertaking. Like, our local architectural firms are maybe not well equipped to to be the lead on this study, but they may team with a proposer to help inform really what this community wants and needs. So certainly not 50, but I'm optimistic that we'll have a solid handful of high quality proposals to choose from. Again, a qualifications-based selection. I believe the schedule anticipates notice to proceed in July, should it all play out as planned.
I've just got one question for you, Adam. When you're talking about the development of a high level, I mean, we did high level with O'Brien, and then we ended up doing something totally different than what high level actually said once we got into the program and the project itself. So are you good enough with high level, or should there be something a little bit more? And like I say, you've talked to the experts on what that means, but I'm just, that's a recent example of one where we thought one thing going into it, and then when we really started to dig into it, it changed into something else. And so I'd hate to go down a path where we, create a bunch of projects, and then once we dig into those projects, they become something else because we didn't quite dig deep enough. Is that clear? Does that you understand?
Absolutely. And you are starting to slide down the slippery slope that this big study looks and feels like. I would like to, I anticipate this study concluding with a scope recommendation for each school in the district that is reflective of that type of analysis. And why this is necessary, the solution that is being applied at O'Brien is different than the solution that's being applied at Swope. Or another way to look at it, the solution that's being applied at O'Brien may not be the solution that is automatically most appropriate at Pine. And the solution that's being applied at Swope may not automatically be the most appropriate solution that's being applied at Dilworth or Trainer or Sparks, sister schools of that type. So I anticipate that the final master plan that comes out of this engagement makes scope-specific recommendations for all of our schools that considers the different variables that led to the conclusions the projects that we see at Swope and O'Brien, and also is informed qualitatively as well, right? Because there's not everybody's going to be able to get a new school.
Totally get that, and to tug on that just a little bit more, then these solutions, will they also come with it's like, hey, this solution is good for the next 5 years. After that, it's going to have to be looked at again, i.e., is there going to be a recurrence of this some point in the future to validate that those are still valid assumptions and conclusions? Because, what had transpired at Swope maybe potentially in 5 years might have been a different realization if we were to look at it 5 years down the road because of whatever transpired in the region.
Ultimately, this is going to be a plan. It's going to be a plan that carries a lot of weight and that we're going to endeavor to execute with as much fidelity as possible. But just like the ballot initiative of WC1 that we continually strive to execute to the letter of the law, we've deviated from that specific program of projects as circumstances have dictated or warranted through extensive discussion and transparent action. In a similar way, I see this plan informing a very detailed program of projects for upwards of 10-year horizon, but that with each and every year and with each and every project authorization necessary, we'll have that conversation over again, and we won't deviate, I expect, from that plan, trivially, because it will have been so rigorously authored in the first place, and that we'll be respectful of all of the input that went into it. But we'll have the opportunity to deviate from it if circumstances warrant, slow it down if resources or demand dictate, or if for some other reason circumstances warrant, it's a plan until it's not.
I thought I was getting away with no questions, and then you went and asked yours, so it brought it more to me. Adam, I think, and I just want to kind of run this by you, but what I foresee in this plan is, the baby boomer schools are going to be looked at much more in depth than we're going to be looking at the Mendives or the other schools. There's not, I don't foresee, although obviously O'Brien is a newer school than several other of the middle schools perhaps, but it seems to me as though we should have a fairly in-depth understanding after we see the results of this as to kind of what the next ones are going to be, and kind of in a detailed understanding of, because of the site of this school, we don't have the room to do what we did at O'Brien, maybe what we're doing more like at Swope. And I'm assuming we're going to have some sort of detail of that, and then really just a 30,000-foot overview of the newer schools that really aren't going to be affected right now, because we're probably not going to be rebuilding schools that are 20 or even 30 years old, probably, realistically. Is that correct?
Yeah, and even if I could restate that, I think the construction solutions to achieve that greater level of facility equity will be simpler with the more modern schools. So, we'll still have a similar level of detail prescribed for, say, O'Brien as, say, Vaughn, but the solutions will be more intensive to get Vaughn to where we want it to be versus to get Mendive to where we want it to be.
Yeah, but just real quick, but the people that are doing the study are going to actually, I'm assuming, go in depth at the schools so that we're out ahead of it, like we were saying before, like Dave was saying before, so that we're not, hey, we're going to rebuild this school and then later on be like, oh, hey, now that we kind of, knocked down some drywall and got into, it's better to tear the school down and it's completely out. We're going to get a fairly in-depth, for the $2 million, we're going to get a fairly in-depth understanding. I mean, something we can really wrap our hands around.
For every single existing school in the district, yes. Yep. And if the Marcy Hers only warrants no capital investment, just ongoing capital renewal, that's going to be included, every school in the district, a recommended scope, approximate budget, and prioritization or schedule within the program of projects. This school, Mendive, is in better shape than Shaw, is in better shape than Billinghurst, or something like that, of like building types. The facility solution maybe is similar across those three, or maybe is slightly different. Laying that out at whatever 1,000-foot level is appropriate for this study, but every school with that level of granularity.
And I think, Charlene Bybee for the record, I think you might have just answered my question. So when they do this in-depth of each school, they will also come up with a prioritization of each school, whatever level it is. So we might have, more elementary schools that need, that are top priority ahead of, it isn't necessarily the grade level, it's going to be what they determine each school needs, and then on that needs list, prioritized or is that part of the public process too? But they will be doing public input as well to determine the prioritization of what goes first.
I mean, that's one of the more difficult aspects of this process. So it will very much be a part of the public contribution and this committee's contribution. There will be variables such as student achievement, socioeconomic variables associated with the student population, maybe that inform the proposed schedule. But yeah, the sequence that these projects are proposed to occur in is also a part of this study scope.
Maybe just one last, is there a possibility that when the public input portion comes out, that we can be informed when those meetings will be, so that, I'm not saying we're going to participate in it, but it would be, certainly might be kind of nice to listen to those meetings, if that's a possibility.
Of course. Yes.
All right. Any other? Mr. Diss.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm assuming when there's going to be money attached to these decisions, it's going to come before us, and then ultimately the board's going to have to approve. So is the board going to have the ability to switch around the priority if they disagree with what's recommended to them? Because it's going to get very sticky.
So back to the cadence item that we heard earlier, I'm going to strive to bring this to the committee and the board on multiple occasions in public meetings. Ultimately, when it comes before the board for action, following recommendation action from the committee, in order for them to modify the recommendation of this committee, the bylaws or the policy associated with this committee actually require it to go back to committee. So it's very unique in that sense with respect to this committee, that they cannot unilaterally modify a recommendation of this committee as opposed to other committees that don't have that rigid of board policy informing them.
So that applies.
We're hoping that what you're describing gets worked out before it gets to that point.
Sure, I get that, but at some level it becomes a political question, and I just want to make sure that they can't change the amounts that we recommend, but I also want to ensure that they can't change the priority that is recommended to them as well, and that's what I'm hearing you say.
No, it's very explicit in the policy that informs this body, that the board policy related to this committee. It's very clear that if I forget exactly the verbiage, but if a disagreement exists, that it must go back and iterate until.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions on this item? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to item 2.06, which is the presentation, discussion, and possible action to recommend approval of $2.1 million to the 2021-2022 D Major Projects Program. Mr. Searcy.
Okay, good evening. This is our action item related to much of the scope that we've been discussing. I genuinely appreciate the dialogue. We appreciate the significance of these budgetary allocations. We attempted to address last meeting's questions related to this particular table through Mr. Mather's presentation related to the CIP. The nature of our funding sources and the projected capacity of those funding sources. So we did not modify this table. Instead, we've updated the numbers on the committed column with for example, the contract execution of the new elementary school, Jaywood Raw Elementary School, and other encumbrances since the last time we've met. But in that center green column, the recommendation is the 21-22D Major Projects Program, broken down between a core school investment comprehensive modernization study at $2 million and an 2022 vendor agreed upon procedure services for $100,000, total recommended allocation of $2.1 million. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Searcy? I do have just one quick question. So on the core school investment, you show the $2 million for the comprehensive study. So a total allocated of $2.5 million, a total committed of 0.29, so $290,000. Is the balance between the $500,000 that's already been committed and that portion that's been allocated available just in case the $2 million is not enough for the level of study we just discussed?
It would be. Technically, the allocation of $500,000 was actually approved by this committee several years ago related to studies that we conducted on Swope and O'Brien. We also had funding to conduct studies, high-level studies on the Billinghurst-Mendive style of school and on the Reed-McQueen style of high school. But we only used approximately $300,000 of that. So if for some reason that this current budgetary authorization is not sufficient, technically we have a little more than that that's been authorized.
I'm not saying it's going to be more expensive, but I have a feeling it's going to be more expensive when you actually go out there. So I'm just curious.
Like I said before, it will be a negotiated fee and scope agreement, so I'm optimistic we'll be able to fit it within the approved budget.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. With that, I'll entertain a motion.
Justin Ivory for the record. I move to approve the use of $2.1 million for the core school investment and the external capital audit.
Well, second.
I've got a motion and a second. Is there any public comment on this item?
Sorry, I wasn't looking up when someone seconded.
Oh, it's, Anderson.
Okay, thank you. And no public comment.
All right, very good. So got a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that carries unanimously. That takes us on to item 3.01. Besides the public comment that was emailed to us earlier today, is there any other public comments this evening?
That is the only one.
All right, thank you very much. Item 3.2, as Mr. Searcy mentioned earlier in the day, maybe we'll have a meeting on June 9th. Maybe we won't. We'll keep that date anyway. So thank you for that. Go
June
ahead.
we like. August.
Oh, that's right. June was a good one. That's right. Sorry. August, maybe not.
A quick
I'm
question.
jumping ahead, maybe.
I thought you gave us a June 2nd date, and on our agenda it says June 9th.
All right. Well, so we like the first Thursday of the month. What is that?
Oh, on this calendar you gave us.
Right.
In the packet, it says June 2nd. At the end of our agenda, it says June 9th.
Great catch. Traditionally, the first Thursday of the month, of every even-numbered month, so that would be June 2nd.
Okay, June 2nd it is then.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you for the clarification.
All right.
We'll make sure your calendar's straight and give you a reminder, but we look to need that meeting for our fiscal year program approvals.
Perfect. All right, very good.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll go on to 3.03. This meeting is adjourned.